We have cute oxen! Hooray! Video over. No, I'm just kidding. Let's take a look. Here we finally have the Grand Cathay roster reveal. I think we've been waiting for this for quite a while, but let's take a look here. Right at the top of this roster reveal, they even say we've waited too long for this one. The first thing described is Miao Ying, the storm dragon. She is pretty cool. I mean, hard to deny how epic she is. Apparently she'll have the lures of yin and life. So she'll be able to heal, which is probably really good given she's going to be a massive single entity. And it looks like the disdain of dragons will debuff people around her. Perfect for a giant melee lord. Next we have Xiaoming, the Iron Dragon. So we all know he's a little bit crazy, but apparently he commands loyalty, so that's cool. And he's going to have lots of magic trinkets, so Easter Nicket. Both of the Dragon Lords will be able to swap forms mid-battle. This doesn't really describe how that works or how many times it can happen, but we do know that they can change in battle, and it sounds like we'll be able to control it. Xiaoming is going to have spells from the lores of Yang and Metal. Great, Metal! So I think we're all hoping that the lore of Yang's going to be decent, or he's going to be a little bit of a flop here. What is interesting is it does seem like he'll be a little bit more of a defensive lord, where he can pass near invulnerability to his nearby troops for a short time. Perhaps he'll be a little bit like the Coatls, where everything under him has some invulnerability. We have a look here at the general lords, including the dragon-blooded Shugengan Lord? I don't know. I'm giving it my best shot. These guys can apparently come with either the lore of Yang or the lore of Yin, so we'll have a good choice here. The lore of Yang is the one that comes with the Iron Dragon, and it does look somewhat defensive, which matches what he's doing. We've got a shield. We've got a wall of wind and fire, which might prevent the enemy from walking through it. We've got a stone ground stance, which will protect them. And who knows what Constellation of the Dragon's doing, or Might of Heaven and Earth. Dragon's Breath does seem offensive, so there's one offensive spell in there at least. But the Iron Dragon really looks defensive, which is interesting considering he's not the one defending the Great Bastion. They describe the lore of Yin as being more esoteric, so we'll see that on the Storm Dragon. This is where the reflection of projectiles will show up, so I'm thinking the lore of Yin might be pretty popular. We also have Storm of Shadows and Cloak of Jet, which both seem like buffs to your units somehow. Missile Mirror is probably where you're reflecting the projectiles. Blossom Wind also seems like it's probably a buff or debuff. Talons of Night, honestly, comes across as buff or debuff for me too. And then Ancestral Warriors, which is probably the spell that they describe as Summon the Ghosts of the Dead. That might be interesting. We'll see how well they actually work in combat. These mage lords can get a warhorse or Jade Longma mount. The Jade Longma is going to be a flying unit, so that's going to be really nice to be able to have some casting lords that can zoop around the battlefield. We're also going to have access to a melee lord, the Lord Magistrate. They're described as being not the greatest single combatants of their nation, but they're expert commanders. So hopefully that means they do a lot to buff their troops, since they're not really meant to be in sustained combat. These guys also get a warhorse mount, or they can fly in a sky lantern, which is probably really good for sitting above your troops and boosting them. These boosts seem to come as increased bonuses received by troops working in harmony with one another. So we'll see how that unfolds, but this is really going to be a buffing lord. We're going to have to see some major buffs, I think, for anyone to grab this over one of the casting lords, from what I can tell. Now we have a look at heroes. First up, they have the alchemist, and it says here that alchemists gravitate to the Iron Dragon. So I'm guessing he's going to have some extra capacity or special buildings for them so that he has access to more in the campaign. Apparently the alchemist's potions imbue them with spells from the lore of metal and can give them unique buffs that can be applied to themselves or nearby units. Hopefully we see some reworks to the lore of metal if this is going to be a big thing. But it is pretty interesting to know that there is going to be so much metal here. That does give me hope that they're going to change the way the spells go a little bit. These guys can have a warhorse mount, so they can go pretty fast. Next we have an Astromancer, which apparently uses the lore of heavens. These guys will get a warhorse mount or a Whooshing War Compass, which is basically a chariot. Moving on, we have Grand Cathay's units. And I remember when I talked about Grand Cathay being a little bit like Bretonia, and people were like, but we're horses. Here it is, folks. Grand Cathay's infantry, peasant long spearmen. There you go. I was right. Anyway, we definitely see some tiers of infantry here. We've got the peasants, who are the backbone of Grand Cathay, and they're numerous beyond count. And they are the least trained armies of Grand Cathay, but are still a power to be reckoned with through sheer force of numbers. It does seem, though, that they're going to be expendable, as you would expect from peasants. Peasant long spearmen are yang aligned, so they have increased leadership and melee defense when close to a yin unit, which is going to be a ranged unit. So planning out where you lay your units is going to be very important here, especially if you have unit caps. Next we have Jade Warriors, which seem like more of a standard infantry. They're described as being expertly trained as part of the standing army. But each city maintains its own regiment of Jade Warriors, and few make their home outside of one of the metropolises, which tells me that there's going to be some limited use to these guys. Who knows if it'll be recruitment caps, or if they're going to be somewhat like Menace Belows, where you can summon them to the battlefield within your land or something. The Jade Warriors are supposed to have a defensive stance, which is going to make them the ideal front line for protecting those ranged units, since they're going to be very hard to charge and kill that way. It looks like they'll come in two forms, sword and shield and halberd. So one's going to have shields and the other is not. So it's going to be a question of protecting against missile fire or protecting against cavalry. Next, we have the Celestial Dragon Guard. These are the official legion of the Dragon Emperor, and as the Eastern Empire has expanded, more and more Dragon Guard have been added to the Celestial host. Here it says their arrival represents an exponential increase in power for the army. It's curious that they would describe that they can be dispatched to battlefields all over the East, rather than specifically recruitable. We have some interesting mechanics here that seem like the units will kind of pop out of nowhere in order to help certain battles, with the Jade Warriors potentially being available at home versus the Dragon Guard, which seems potentially available on the attack. They are superior to the Jade Warriors, but there are fewer. So we're going to have caps, folks. We're going to have caps. Who knows how this will work, but we will definitely have fewer Dragon Guard than Jade Warriors. Now onto the missile units, which is going to be a very big strength for Grand Cathay. Right at the top here, we have Peasant Archers. Does Peasant Archer spam sound like anyone else? So Peasant Archers are yin aligned, which means they receive bonuses when close to yang units. This doesn't tell us what kind of bonuses they get, but given that yang units are melee and yin units are ranged, maybe it'll be like those bonuses to reduced reload time or something like that. We'll see how that goes. It might be nice if we get something more like explosive damage, but we'll see. These units are also expendable, which seems to be the case with all the peasants, but also expected. They shouldn't really be in combat. Next, we'll have the Iron Hail Gunners, which is apparently like a shotgun. It's a short-range blunderbuss that can rip through almost anything if positioned correctly. They do have a bit of armor, so that's nice. And they will have armor-piercing shots when they can hit. So hopefully their range isn't terribly short, or hopefully you'll be able to position melee units around it in such a manner that you will be able to shoot without them being engaged in combat. Next we have the Crane Gun, which requires 2 people, so this is the one that looked a lot like the Jezzails. One is positioned at the trigger, and one carries a shield. This is basically Cathay's Jezzail. Save artillery, it will outrange anything on the battlefield, acting as effective snipers. This is how you're going to want to snipe enemy lords. They're going to have armor-piercing damage, and their shields are going to mean they're not going to be hit by missile fire themselves as easily. Next, we have the Jade Warrior Crossbowman, described as the ranged backbone of the Grand Cathayan army. There will be 2 versions, a crossbow version and a crossbow and shield version. If you have to plan out your army positioning though, I'm guessing you'll get by with just the crossbow version, given that shields aren't that necessary for your own missile units. It says here that their armor weighs them down slightly, meaning they probably have reduced speed, but they will defeat a peasant archer in all other areas. We'll see how this works out. It's probably the case that they'll have reduced model numbers, so it might still end up being more efficient to have peasant archers. Since they're not described as having armor piercing, it's better to just have more missiles. Then we have a higher tier crossbow, the Celestial Dragon Crossbowmen, who do have armor piercing bolts, and they are by default shielded. The crane gunners will outrange them and deal more damage, but the Dragon Guard are hardier in other forms of warfare. That sounds like the kind of thing that'll work really well for people who liked balanced armies. I'm going to guess people who like your doom stacks, you're probably not going to get too many of the Celestial Dragon Crossbowmen, given that there are other options that work better as damage dealers, and none of these are really supposed to be damage takers. Now let's take a look at Grand Cathay's cavalry and chariots. We have peasant horsemen. These are apparently the fastest Cathayan unit that can't fly. They are going to be vanguard, and they are yang. Given their job is to flank and potentially attack the rear of an enemy army though, their yang assignment is probably not going to mean too much. They're not going to get bonuses, neither will they give bonuses. They're probably reasonable at the beginning if you're facing a lot of enemies with artillery, for example, but I don't see these guys lasting throughout the entire campaign. Next, we have Jade Lancers, described as Grand Cathay's mainstay cavalry. They're slower but heavier than standard horsemen. They are probably pretty good defensively. We'll see how cav charges work in this game, but the lack of speed is a bit concerning here. You're probably going to want to pair this with more of a hammer cavalry unit, and this will be your anvil. And your hammer might come in the form of the great longma riders, which are flying cav. So they're probably going to be the fastest on the battlefield. Now we can move on to the Grand Cathay constructs. We're going to have the Terracotta Sentinel. I got the impression these were going to be summonable in battle rather than regular units. And I'm still a little unsure based on what I'm reading here, because it does say that they stand sentinel all over Cathay. It seems to me like they're going to be summonable in battle, but maybe they'll be default in defensive battles? Hard to tell here. It does seem like they'll cause terror, so if you're up against some lower leadership units, that'll be pretty cool. This doesn't actually give us that much information, so hopefully we can get a little bit more on them and see if they're actually going to be units that can be recruited. And since we get access to the lore of life, will we be able to heal these? Anyways, next we can look at the flying war machines. We've got the Sky Lantern. Sky Lanterns are described as glacially slow, which is fine because apparently they're manned by crane gunners. You're gonna have some flying snipers. Reminds me of XCOM. Our next war machine is the Sky Junk. Great name. Hopefully it's not actually junk. It is apparently larger and more deadly than a Sky Lantern. It says that it'll spew fire rain rockets. It is going to be bomb damage, which is usually more, but it's probably going to have a shorter range. So I think it's going to be a little bit of a tough call. Given how large this entity is going to be, you're probably going to prefer the one with the crane gunners. Next, we've got the artillery and war machines. First up, we've got a grand cannon. One mega cannon drawn across the battlefield with oxen. So this seems like it's going to match the bear artillery with Kislev and a little bit reminiscent of maybe the hell cannon, where you have one massive artillery piece. Like most cannons, it's going to have a pretty straight shot, so you're going to want to leave the space open in front of it or have it at higher elevation. My favorite part here is the oxen pulling it are pretty cute. That's what I was waiting for. So exciting! We do have the oxen here, and it says that they'll make the Cathayan artillery more mobile than other counterparts. So that's nice. They're still probably going to be pretty slow, but if you have to run away or if you're reinforcing and have to find a better position, that's probably a good scenario for Cathay versus another faction. Next, we have a Whooshing War Compass. This seems to just be a mount, and the spellcaster is going to have long-range spells. So it should be pretty good for having them mobile across the map and dealing some damage. Though technically not great for melee, it is going to be a yang-aligned unit. Here it says that it'll regain its power with increased speed thanks to control over the elemental winds. This sounds like it might have some vigor bonuses, and that would be pretty nice so that your caster isn't stuck somewhere and is getting caught by fresh units. Next, we have a fire rain rocket. It sounds a little bit like a Hellstorm rocket battery, but probably with shorter range. What's interesting here is that both of the Cathayan artillery pieces have a higher than usual number of support staff, which means that if they do get caught in melee, A, they'll probably be able to keep firing pretty long, and B, it's going to be way harder for them to be killed off. So here's Cathay's roster. What I'm seeing is they're really going to favor a balanced army, making sure that there are at least some melee units in there. Given that, it's probably not going to be a very good auto-resolve faction because we all know that melee is going to get smashed up there. But it's always fun to do an easy battle where you're just chilling and firing your rockets away. So let me know what you think of Cathay. Is this going to be one of your first picks? Why or why not? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for stopping by.